quietly. No breaking headlines, no sudden announcement, only a growing confusion spreading through grocery aisles. In Texas and Ohio, shoppers stared at price tags that made no sense. Nearly $5 for a dozen eggs.
Imagine millions of perfectly good eggs being dumped in fields while cold storage warehouses spill over with food no one can move. Yet shoppers walk into supermarkets and find shelves stocked with pricey imported cartons. It feels unreal, almost backward, like the system somehow flipped upside down overnight. American farmers are destroying food to survive, while stores sell foreign products at record-high prices. So what broke the system? How can a country be drowning in food, but still paying more for it?
Nearly $5 a dozen. But the real shock wasn't just the price. It was the words printed right on the carton, product of Brazil. Meanwhile, on American soil, a devastating scene was unfolding.
It started quietly, almost too quietly for anyone to notice at first. No breaking news, no emergency announcements, nothing that hinted at the mess that was coming. It began with something simple. People in Texas and Ohio standing in their grocery store aisles, staring at egg cartons that now cost nearly $5. That alone was strange enough, but what really stopped shoppers in their tracks were the labels printed across the packaging. Not product of Iowa or product of Indiana, like they were used to seeing. Instead, product of Brazil, packed in Turkey. People blinked, tilted their heads, and checked again. Imported eggs? At a time when American farms were supposed to be running strong? It didn't make sense. And that confusion was just the first crack in a much larger story, one that reveals a system that's supposed to protect American agriculture, but instead is quietly pushing it to the edge. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the sweeping tariffs introduced under the Trump administration. These tariffs were placed on a huge range of imported goods coming from Mexico, Canada, and China, sometimes up to 25%. The idea behind them wasn't complicated. The goal was to shield American farmers and manufacturers from cheaper foreign products, giving homegrown industries a fighting chance. On paper, it looked like a solid move. If foreign goods become more expensive, people and companies inside the United States have more incentive to buy American. That's the theory. But reality doesn't always stick to the script. What happened instead was a kind of domino effect that no one fully prepared for. Countries on the receiving end of these tariffs didn't just shrug and accept them. They pushed back. Some retaliated with their own tariffs. Others quietly shifted their buying strategies. Long-standing trade relationships, built over decades, suddenly became shaky. And one of the biggest, most painful consequences of this shift fell directly on American farmers. Let's take Canada, for example. For years, they were one of the most dependable buyers of American eggs. Every season, millions of dozens crossed the border without issue. Farmers counted on those export orders the same way workers count on a steady paycheck. But when tariffs changed the math, Canada didn't complain loudly or issue dramatic warnings. They simply went elsewhere. They canceled contracts worth over 170 million dozen eggs and filled the gap with cheaper imports from Brazil and suppliers in the European Union. No shouting, no negotiation, just a quiet exit. And while other countries made similar moves, American farmers suddenly found themselves sitting on mountains of unsold product. Eggs that were meant for export never left. They just piled up, first in cold storage, then in overflow units, and eventually in places where farmers had no choice but to dump them. We are talking millions of eggs sitting untouched while grocery store prices kept climbing. It's the kind of contradiction that makes you wonder if the whole system is upside down. Meanwhile, shoppers were feeling something very different. From their point of view, prices were through the roof. They weren't seeing an oversupply. They were seeing the most expensive eggs in years. They saw empty shelves, shortages, and imported cartons placed where local brands used to be. For the average person walking through a supermarket, the message seemed obvious: eggs must be scarce. But what they didn't know was that, at that exact moment, American farmers were drowning in surplus.
By early summer, the United States found itself with a staggering surplus of more than 60 million eggs and no market willing to buy them. What was once a steady business model began to look like a slow-motion collapse, and the trust that took...
Picture a warehouse built to hold eggs for maybe a few weeks at a time. Now imagine that same warehouse packed so tightly that pallets are touching the ceiling, with no buyers in sight and no trucks scheduling pickups. In states like Iowa, Indiana, and Ohio, this wasn't just an occasional problem. It became the new normal. Some farms had more than 12 million dozen eggs stacked up in cold storage, far more than they could realistically sell before the eggs expired. And even worse, the prices farmers were being offered for their product weren't just low, they were painful. At local markets, some farmers were selling eggs for 60 or 70 cents per dozen. That's barely enough to cover feed, let alone labor and fuel. And while farmers were barely scraping by, big chain grocery stores were still selling those imported eggs for $4 to $5. That's the part that feels almost surreal. Instead of American eggs moving from farm to shelf, foreign eggs were being flown and shipped in from thousands of miles away. And the people producing eggs inside the country couldn't find anyone willing to buy theirs. How does a country end up in a situation where food is overflowing on farms, yet consumers think there's a shortage? The answer lies deep inside the supply chain. Tariffs changed the costs of importing and exporting. Bird flu outbreaks created uncertainty about supply. Overseas buyers lost confidence. Shipping routes got backed up. Inspections slowed down. And once a supply chain starts to clog, it doesn't unclog itself easily. Every delay creates another delay. Every cancellation creates more surplus, and every lost buyer takes months, sometimes years, to win back. So what you end up with is a strange, almost unbelievable scenario. On one side, you have American farmers dumping millions of dollars worth of food because there's no one left to buy it. On the other side, you have American families paying some of the highest egg prices they've seen in years. One side sees abundance, the other sees scarcity, and the space in between, the supply chain, is where things are breaking down. That's where the real irony comes in. The tariffs were supposed to shield American farmers from global competition. They were supposed to help protect local industries, but in reality they pushed buyers away, raised costs, and opened the door for cheaper imports to replace American goods on American shelves. The policy meant to protect farmers has ended up crushing them. And the people paying the price, literally, are the farmers who can't sell their product and the consumers who can't afford to buy it. This isn't just an economic issue, it's an emotional one. Imagine waking up every day, caring for your animals, collecting thousands of eggs, paying for equipment and electricity and feed, only to learn that the market you've depended on for years has vanished overnight. Imagine having to dump perfectly good food because no truck is scheduled to pick it up. Meanwhile, families who live 20 minutes away walk into their local store and buy imported eggs, because that's the only option on the shelf. It's frustrating, it's confusing, and it makes people lose trust in a system that's supposed to support them. Farmers are asking why their product can't reach local shelves. Consumers are asking why imported goods are replacing domestic ones. And everyone, on both sides, is wondering how a country with so much food can still struggle this much. If this is what happens to something as basic as eggs, what does that mean for larger, more complex parts of the food system? That's the part that worries both farmers and experts the most. Because once a supply chain breaks, rebuilding it isn't as simple as flipping a switch. You have to rebuild trust, renegotiate contracts, repair relationships, and convince buyers that American producers are stable again.
Agriculture, bird flu has affected more than 166 million birds across the U.S. since 2022. In January and February alone, the U.S. lost about 43 million birds to the disease. Here in Virginia, there have been
It's almost hard to believe how fast things went downhill, because none of this started with trade policies or foreign imports. The real collapse began with something farmers had absolutely no control over: the 2025 avian flu outbreak. It hit harder than almost anyone expected. By the time it was over, nearly 38 million hens across the country had been culled to stop the virus from spreading. That number is so big it almost doesn't feel real. Imagine entire barns, entire farms, emptied out overnight. Egg production didn't just dip, it fell off a cliff. Farmers were suddenly dealing with fewer hens, less output, and a ton of uncertainty about how long it would take to rebuild their flocks. And while the birds were disappearing, the cost of keeping the remaining ones alive was soaring. Feed prices were climbing month after month, partly because grain markets were already shaky and partly because transportation had become a mess. Trucks were backed up, drivers were in short supply, diesel prices were unpredictable. On top of that, farms were struggling to hire enough workers to keep operations running. Some farms had half the workforce they needed. Others were relying on family members to do jobs that normally required whole teams. Every part of the process, from feeding to cleaning to packaging, was slowed down because there simply weren't enough hands or hours to keep up. The combined effect made U.S. egg production look unreliable to foreign buyers. And once international markets start thinking you're unreliable, confidence collapses fast. Buyers who had spent years working with American producers suddenly grew nervous. They didn't want to sign contracts for millions of dozens of eggs if they weren't sure the shipments would arrive on time. And once that doubt creeps in, it spreads. Countries that had imported from the U.S. for decades started exploring alternatives, not out of anger, but out of practicality.
System work. Heather, the system in place since the 1970s was designed to protect Canadian dairy farmers. U.S. producers can face the kind of massive tariffs Trump mentioned. But
Canada was the biggest blow. They were one of the United States' most trusted and high-volume egg buyers. Year after year, millions of dozens crossed the border without any issue. But in 2025, as the avian flu numbers grew and production dipped, Canada made a decision that shocked farmers across the Midwest. They quietly canceled contract orders totaling 170 million dozen eggs. No press conference, no warning, just a sudden shift. Instead of waiting for U.S. supply to stabilize, they turned to Brazil and European Union producers who could deliver large quantities at lower prices and with fewer risks. Once Canada stepped back, other countries followed. It wasn't personal, it was business. But for American farmers, it felt like the ground beneath them disappeared. Export orders vanished. Year-long partnerships evaporated. And without those buyers, the U.S. entered one of the fastest and most painful collapses in export demand the egg industry had ever seen. Farmers who were used to shipping multiple truckloads a week now had eggs piling up in storage with nowhere to go. By early summer 2025, the numbers were staggering. More than 60 million eggs were sitting in cold storage across the country. That's not a typo. 60 million eggs that were supposed to be on trucks, on ships, or on shelves were instead just sitting. And the most heartbreaking part? Many of them would never leave storage alive. Eggs don't last forever, even under perfect conditions. And cold storage units weren't designed for long-term preservation. They were built to hold product temporarily, maybe a month at most, before it moved out to buyers. But now, those same units were holding eggs for months at a time because no one wanted them. Iowa, the heart of America's egg industry, was facing the worst of it. In just 3 months, farms across the state had stored over 12 million dozen eggs. That's more than most countries produce in an entire year. Barns that were supposed to be bustling with activity became quiet, and warehouses that were meant for rotation became overflowing monuments to a broken system. Every day, new pallets were added, and every day farmers had fewer options. Indiana, Ohio, Missouri, and Minnesota weren't far behind. According to the USDA, their egg surpluses were 2.5 times higher than the same period the year before. That kind of increase doesn't happen in a healthy system. It happens when the market collapses under its own weight, and that's exactly what was happening. Cold storage capacity across those states was stretched so thin that some producers had to rent emergency spaces, old refrigerated trailers, unused warehouse corners, even temporary facilities set up with aging equipment. Anything they could find to keep the eggs from spoiling. But here's the thing. Storing eggs for months isn't cheap. Electricity alone was enough to drain a farm's profits. Then add labor costs, packaging, maintenance of storage units, and the constant checks needed to keep the temperature and humidity stable. Farmers weren't earning money off these eggs, they were bleeding money just trying to prevent them from spoiling too quickly. Every day an egg stayed in storage, it lost value. And every day it stayed there, farmers sank deeper into financial trouble. Some tried everything they could to move the product. They lowered prices to the cheapest levels seen in years. They called old buyers, tried new markets, even attempted to coordinate direct-to-consumer sales. But when international buyers had already moved on and domestic buyers were either locked into existing contracts or overloaded with inventory, there just wasn't enough demand to absorb the surplus. And the craziest part? Even though farmers were swimming in eggs they couldn't sell, shoppers still saw high prices at the grocery store. They had no idea millions of eggs were sitting in refrigerated containers with no destination. They only saw the price tag in front of them, and it didn't match the story they were hearing about oversupply. So by the middle of 2025, you had a perfect storm. Farmers producing eggs they couldn't sell, foreign buyers shifting their loyalty to other countries, and cold storage units across the Midwest filled with food that might never make it to anyone's table. The preservation costs were skyrocketing while farmers' incomes were collapsing, and the entire situation felt like watching a slow-motion disaster that no one seemed able to stop. If this is what happens when one link in the chain breaks, a virus, a few canceled contracts, a drop in production confidence, then it shows just how fragile the whole system really is. Because once the buyers are gone and the eggs start piling up, rebuilding that trust and restarting those export channels doesn't happen overnight.
So that means the countdown to supply shortages and rising prices has officially begun. Goods that were loaded after April 9th are going to be hit with a 145% tariff.
Huge tariff.
It's strange, isn't it? You walk into a supermarket in Texas or Ohio and pick up a carton of eggs, and the price hits you like a slap. $4, maybe $5 for a dozen. You look closer and your eyebrows shoot up. Product of Brazil. Packed in Turkey. And you can't help thinking, wait, we're importing eggs now? At the same time, you might see videos online of American farmers dumping perfectly good food because no one is buying it. Millions of dollars in produce, milk, and eggs going straight into the ground or rotting in storage, while shoppers like us keep paying high prices. It feels backwards, it feels broken. And honestly, that's exactly what's happening right now. The U.S. food supply chain is snapping under pressure, and farmers are the ones paying the price. A huge part of this mess actually goes back a few years, to the Trump administration's tariff strategy. The idea seemed simple enough on paper. Put tariffs, up to 25%, on imported goods from major trading partners like Mexico, Canada, and China. The goal was to protect American farmers by making foreign goods more expensive, so domestic agriculture could finally get a fair shake. At least, that was the plan. But the moment those tariffs hit, retaliation hit back even harder. Countries that used to buy billions of dollars in American crops suddenly backed off. Contracts were canceled overnight. Long-term buyers shifted to new suppliers, Brazil, Argentina, India, because once a country changes suppliers, they don't often switch back. It's like breaking up with someone who immediately finds someone cheaper and more consistent. Good luck convincing them to return. And then came the strangest twist of all. While the U.S. tried to shield its own farmers, American importers began relying even more on cheaper foreign suppliers. So the very policy meant to protect American agriculture ended up feeding the very competition it wanted to weaken. It's one of those ironies you almost have to laugh at, except no one affected by it is laughing. What this did to farmers is heartbreaking. You drive through rural parts of the Midwest or the South, and you see barns that used to hum with activity now padlocked. Packing lines that once ran day and night are silent. In the second quarter of 2025 alone, 64 medium and small farms closed, many of them family-owned for generations. Picture a farm that's been in a family since the 1930s, now having to shut its doors because they simply can't sell what they grow. They're not closing because they failed. They're closing because the system around them failed. And when farmers do try to sell locally, it's almost painful to watch. Some egg farmers are quietly admitting they're selling dozens for 60 to 70 cents at local markets, just trying to scrape together enough to keep the lights on. But the same eggs, if they somehow make it through the tangled supply chain to a supermarket shelf, get priced at nearly $5. And shoppers are left wondering why eggs are suddenly a luxury item, while farmers are wondering why their eggs are sitting in warehouses instead of stores. The contradiction feels like something out of a bad comedy. On one side, American families are paying inflated prices. On the other, American farmers are drowning in unsold food. And stuck in the middle is a supply chain that simply isn't working anymore. Let's talk about where things are actually breaking, because it's not just one weak link, it's several of them snapping at once. First, transportation routes are bottlenecked. Sure, some produce and eggs are ready to ship, but there aren't enough available trucks, or the trucks are stuck behind delayed inspection points. Even when farmers have buyers ready, the goods can't physically get to where they need to go fast enough. That's why warehouses are filling up with food that spoils before it's ever loaded onto a truck. Then you've got inspections and certifications. We don't really think about this as shoppers, but everything that ends up in a store has to go through a maze of federal and state checks. Those inspection offices are backed up, short-staffed, underfunded, completely overwhelmed. So even when food is perfectly fine to eat, it gets stuck waiting for paperwork. Sometimes it waits too long. And once it's no longer fresh by regulatory definition, it can't go to stores. So where does it go? You guessed it, the dump.
Morgan is projecting that they expect
Export channels are another disaster. Before all the tariff fights, a lot of U.S. produce and dairy had reliable international buyers. But once those countries slapped on retaliatory tariffs, American exports plummeted. And since there's no clear replacement market, farmers are producing more than the domestic system can absorb. With exports gone, the pipeline is clogged on both ends. Even cold storage facilities are overloaded. Imagine giant warehouses packed floor to ceiling with eggs, cheese, apples, potatoes, some of it frozen, some of it not. These facilities are meant for temporary storage, not long-term hoarding. But with the supply chain jammed in every direction, food is just sitting there, and sitting, and sitting. Farmers can't afford to store it forever, and when storage fees start exceeding the value of the food itself, dumping becomes the only option. It's a cruel calculation, but that's where many farmers are stuck. And here's the absurdity that really sums up the whole situation. American farm eggs can't reach American supermarket shelves, but foreign imports can. So a farmer in Iowa might be staring at a warehouse of unsold eggs, while a carton from Brazil appears neatly stocked in a grocery store 30 miles away. It's the kind of thing that makes you question whether anyone in charge actually understands how broken things are. Farmers know the demand is there. Shoppers know the prices are too high. Yet the system refuses to connect the two. Instead, it finds a way to hurt both sides simultaneously. You might think this would be making big headlines every day, but the truth is, most people only notice the symptoms. The strange labels on products, the rising prices, the sense that something is off. But behind the scenes, real families are losing their farms, real food is being thrown away, and real money, millions of dollars, is evaporating into thin air. And unless something changes fast, whether that means fixing tariff policies, investing in domestic transport and inspection systems, or finally simplifying the tangled maze of regulations, this crisis is only going to grow. Farmers are resilient, but not invincible. Once a family farm shuts down, it rarely reopens. Right now, the supply chain isn't bending, it's breaking, and the people holding it together with their bare hands are running out of strength.